Okay, I know everyone voted for me to talk about the movie about the killer alien tongue, but I'm going to save that for a later date when I don't have many other things to work on and I can find more to say about it. And considering I am fully planning on expanding my thoughts on this rancid piece of cheese, I figured I might as well make something positive before I do that. So, let's talk about why Brigsby Bear is a film that's so relevant it's practically timeless.
There's magic and wonders and mysteries in store. A hero whose mission is to learn and explore. He's daring and caring and oh so much more. It's Brigsby Bear.
But first, I think we can agree that today's culture and entertainment seems to be based around two things. Divisive politics that judge people by their physical appearance and personal beliefs as opposed to who they are as a person, and the use of nostalgia in an attempt to recapture people's childhoods to varying degrees of success. It's no secret that Hollywood has primarily left original projects to the wayside in favor of remakes, reboots, sequels, and rebrandings. Most tend to flop or be forgotten, while others make bank. But in today's nostalgia-ridden culture, we tend to lose ourselves in the past so much that we tend to forget what's ahead of us. Which brings us to Sony Pictures' Brigsby Bear. Brigsby Bear is a 2017 comedy-drama film co-written by Kyle Mooney and Kevin Costello of Saturday Night Live, and directed by Dave McCary, that was inspired by Mooney's own fascination with old children's shows. The film itself tells the story of James, played by Mooney himself, a sheltered man who lives in a seemingly post-apocalyptic world where the bunker he and his family live is one of the few safe places left, where his only real entertainment comes from an old cheesy TV show called Brigsby Bear Adventures. Think of it as the unholy love child between Star Trek and Bear in the Big Blue House. James is content with his simple life with only his parents being his only real human contact, until his world is turned upside down when it's revealed that the protective dome he was trapped in was actually meant to keep him trapped. James was actually kidnapped as an infant, and the ones raising him were actually his kidnappers.
What a twist!
Hey, did you hear something?
No.
Did I?
I don't know.
And though he is sent to live with his real family and does find friends, James has a hard time adjusting to the real world, with Brigsby being the only real lens he can see things through. Which is made even worse when he learns Brigsby Bear was actually made by his captors for only him and no one else to see. So, in an attempt to maybe find some closure, he and his new friend set out to give Brigsby Bear Adventures the ending it deserves. Now, I know that plot by itself doesn't actually sound all too thrilling, but where I think it excels is with its subtle comedy, subtle drama, and of course, its commentary on today's obsession with nostalgia and culture that is not on the nose. Brigsby Bear Adventures, the in-universe show, is the kind of show that, if it were real, would have a massive cult following for how weird it was and would find a new niche within today as the source of innumerable memes. Something that actually happens when some episodes are uploaded online.
Is an unnatural emotion.
And yes, we do start the movie off with an actual episode of Brigsby Bear. But enough about that, let's talk about what makes it work. And I think that comes perfectly from its main character. Even though it's a comedy, at its core, Brigsby Bear is a story following the tragedy of a man unable to enjoy what would otherwise be a happy ending, and as a result, unable to move on with his life. Though he is not the deepest character put to film, James himself, I feel, is a very fleshed out character. One who, despite being in a situation that doesn't happen all too often, is someone that you can easily root for. James is a person who, due to his circumstances, is unfamiliar with social etiquette, and even people like his sister aren't too thrilled about him at first. But through his simple enjoyment of an even simpler show, he wins people over not by proving himself or by winning some game or any number of cliches you can think of. People start liking him as who he is. A guy with simple goals and simple joy who is able to bring a smile to people. It's also this naivete that brings on the film's humor. It doesn't ridicule James' lack of experience and obsession with Brigsby. Instead, it uses it for both objectively hilarious moments, like when James gets drunk and hallucinates Brigsby's arch-nemesis,
How are you possibly this wasted right now?
to a scene where he tries to apologize for drunkenly hooking up with a girl at a party and thinking that made them a couple. It's kind of like Shrek in the sense that it isn't a fast-paced bombastic comedy like its sequel, but is instead slower and more laid back and lets the interactions between the characters be what makes the comedy. Actually, this brings up a good point of interest. That same girl, instead of telling him off that they were never a couple, instead takes his misunderstanding in good humor and they both move on. No one is dejected or rejected, they just go on with their lives. Honestly, this is one of the things I love about the movie. It's just so refreshing to see a character who is unable to fit in for a reason that doesn't involve him being a loser, a nerd, a newcomer, or because the plot demands it. Hell, he actually becomes a local celebrity in one night. No, it's because his whole worldview has been turned upside down in literal minutes. He's stuck with people he never met that say they're his family but are unable to make any familial connection with him. He's in a world where he thought even so much as breathing the air could kill him is actually perfectly fine. He's thrown into a brand new life he has no knowledge of in general. Think of James as like a car that's stuck at a fork in the road. Where do they go next? And that is James's story. Where does he go next? Throughout the film, while James and friends are making Brigsby Bear the movie, he experiences indirect and even direct opposition from those that probably have the most authority in his life. His parents, his psychologist, and even the authorities, all of whom fear his obsession is just keeping him from living a normal life. Even to the point of having to put him in the cuckoo's nest just to, in their mind, help him. I mean, when he's making his own homegrown explosives just for one scene, why wouldn't they? Which also ties back into James, where alongside his desire to give his favorite character a proper send-off, he sometimes longs for his old life of captivity. And while that is definitely not healthy for him to do so, it's completely understandable. Sure, he was held prisoner, but things were simple back then. The world was black and white, all he needed was just his fake parents and Brigsby. He was content. And now that he's out in the real world, the messy, complicated real world that's filled with a lot more gray areas, he finds it difficult because nothing makes sense. But that's the thing about the past. It's the past. It doesn't define your future. What you do in the present time defines it. And through making this movie, it's actually very helpful for him both with his desires as a Brigsby fan and as something therapeutic. It helps him come to terms with what's happened and maybe even allows him to move on with his life. Which all leads up to one of the best scenes in the movie, where after everything else for Brigsby Bear the movie is finished, all that's left for James is to get the voice for Brigsby himself. So James, now living a life of freedom, has to confront the man he used to call Dad, now locked up behind bars. I should mention his fake father is played by Mark Hamill, and he sells the role perfectly. He wasn't the one who kidnapped James, but ultimately chose to go along with his wife and went through with it. He legitimately cares about James, but knows what he did was truly wicked. And his performance perfectly captures the kind of tragedy a character like this could only have.
Some part of me felt like you were our boy. And we wanted to give you everything we had to give.
And how does James react? He's not mad or sad. He just wants to make something with the creator of the show he loves. to do something with his old dad one more time. And in a way, both are able to reconcile with each other. And by the end of the movie, his film gets a chance to premiere in a subtle yet fitting way that brings James's journey full circle. But we'll get to that later, because there's one important aspect about this film that adds more layers to it. This has been pointed out by others, so I will go over it quickly. Despite being a film that riddles its atmosphere with a nostalgic feel that one would get going back to films they grew up with, it doesn't follow any of the tropes you'd see from films around that time. Hell, even some movies today. You know the tropes I'm talking about. One-dimensional bullies who treat the protagonist like dirt for no real reason other than they're the bully. A constant need to divide people up by groups by the most superficial means, where nerds are the most accepting while everyone else is the most exclusive. Or how the protagonist would have to prove himself to others just to be accepted. This movie instead chooses to have James be accepted by all manners of people, the kind of people that, in those films that we still try to emulate today, would otherwise treat him like dirt. I think this is intentional because in those films, all of what James achieved or what his friends would do would never happen. But instead of taking the easy way out and making this film another cynical piece of media, Brigsby does something different. It contrasts those things we hold dear in media with the one thing the real world has that fiction doesn't: change. For as exciting as dinosaur theme parks, space nights, superheroes, and any number of things are, they're stuck to a status quo, and as such, whatever happens rarely has consequence, or if it does, rarely affects the world it takes place in. Many things may have changes within its aesthetic or character roster throughout their runs and incarnations, but nothing will change within their world because the status quo forbids it. The Autobots must always be at war with the Decepticons because their conflict is the status quo. Ash will never catch all the Pokemon because him catching Pokemon is the status quo. The X-Men will never make any progress towards mutant rights because them being hated is the status quo. But unlike those fictional worlds we create, our world is always changing. As time passes, old conflicts are resolved and new opportunities open up that were once closed to those previously. And people's goals and motivations are not set in stone.
Russell likes to hurt people for peace.
And even though I crapped on our current culture earlier, I admire the fact that Brigsby Bear wants to remind the viewer of the best parts of it. That the time we're currently living in is probably one of the most accepting. The jock that would otherwise be his bully becomes his best friend. When he drunkenly hooks up with the hot girl, neither is ostracized for that one simple mistake. One that is quickly rectified.
But I'm still also totally into doing that other stuff we did too.
Not a chance.
The sister, while not a big fan of James at first, does try and help him find new friends and enjoy life. Even his new friends' friends come and help him make Brigsby Bear the movie, and none of them have any objections. Instead of being like every other movie that is hyper-politicized or just wants to recreate the movies many people grew up with, Brigsby Bear instead chooses to distance itself from those kinds of cynical films and their tired tropes, and instead chooses to be a film filled with optimism that encourages creativity, actively choosing to display the best qualities of right now as opposed to trying to recapture the past. I can't begin to explain just how satisfying it is to have a movie that does not need to use tired cliches to tell its story. It doesn't need to have James be a liar that's revealed. It doesn't need a forced misunderstanding that divides his social circle. And it especially doesn't need a one-note villain constantly hurting him just because we need a villain. It's just a better movie than that, and it solely relies on James's apparent obsession with Brigsby Bear and what he'll do to make the movie. And truth be told, The inner struggles of a man that had been cut off from society for so long he is effectively trapped in the past and unable to move on with his life is honestly a much more interesting story that raises a lot more drama than what your typical Hollywood movie riddled with overdone cliches, repetitive character dynamics, and predictable events can muster. But James isn't the only character in the film. He has a whole cast of people to both help and oppose him. The hero's journey in this film, while different, is plenty clear. I want my favorite show to have a proper ending. And while it's not the most exciting plot in all of time and space, it does fit within the optimistic and creativity-driven tone the movie is going for. And it's only helped by the other characters. Now these characters, while not fleshed out on their own, do tie into James's growth as a character, and help usher the conflict of the story along, and some certainly go through their own journey as well. There are 5 characters in this film that I think are crucial to James's story. Spence, Aubrey, Greg and Lewis, and Emily. Spence is obviously the first real friend James makes since he is freed, and he does go out of his way to make sure James mingles with people who will accept him. He comes to enjoy Brigsby Bear not because of what it is, but for how passionate James is about it, and to be fair, he does find aspects about Brigsby Bear he likes. And because of this, he not only becomes his best friend, but is the one that helps James pursue his creative passion, and thus setting the hero on his journey. Aubrey is probably the second most important character in the story, as she herself is the one that brings James to the party where he'd meet Spence and his other friends. And while at first she finds him weird and tends to stay away from him, she does help out with his movie, and through seeing his passion for the project, is able to see him as who he is, as opposed to what his actions paint him as. And then you've got the antagonist of the movie. No, not the kidnappers, his therapist, Emily. She is not like his friends who see this as something that's for innocent fun, but as an obsession that's holding James back and is the sole cause of a lot of his issues, and does try to get James to leave it behind even if he doesn't want to. She does not pull any strings or twirls her metaphorical mustache, she is simply trying to help James the way she thinks is right, but it's really just holding James back from what he loves. Which, in return, is contrasted by the final 2 most important characters in the film. Greg and Louise, but mostly Greg. Greg and Louise are James's real family and just want to have an actual connection with their long-lost son. And they try to do a lot of different things with him, as both an attempt to connect with their son and as an attempt to get him to enjoy something that isn't Brigsby. Mostly because they don't see the tapes as innocent fun, as James does, but as Greg put it,
"These are tools used by very sick people to imprison my son."
And it's only when James gets in trouble with the authorities that Greg and Louise finally make it clear to him they no longer approve of Brigsby Bear and only want him and their family to move on from the whole thing. Not just from the homemade bomb he made, but from his fake parents and anything to do with them in general.
These monsters stole you from us, and they destroyed us.
But their main flaw with this viewpoint is that they're only looking at Brigsby from what they see it as, and not how James sees it. And this is where Aubrey finishes her story. Having come to love James and disappointed at his treatment, shows them behind the scenes footage of James having fun, socializing, even experiencing a lot of the things they planned on doing with James. This is what gets them to finally realize that the Brigsby Bear movie is actually helping their child, not holding him back.
Perhaps I treated you too harshly.
They accept Brigsby is a part of James and, through that, finally find a way to bond with their child. Not by doing what they want James to do, but by doing what James wants to do. Either it be the sister that got him out into the world, the best friend that pushes him forward, the parents that'll help him through it, or the therapist that tried to stop him, James is able to achieve what he set out to do. But as James will learn, much like time, he must keep moving forward. Which brings us to the conclusion.
Did you hear?
No.
As you can tell, as Brigsby was his whole life, James has a particularly hard time letting it go and focusing on something else. But, through his experiences, James is able to complete the Brigsby Bear movie I made with my friends, and it's about to premiere. But the struggle isn't over yet, as he has one more hurdle to pass. No, not something predictable like the therapist or out-of-nowhere bullies trying to sabotage the movie, but one that involves a sold-out theater and whether or not people will like it. The stakes are high, but on a personal level. James is afraid no one will like it, even getting himself stressed to the point of illness. If this is just him being afraid of no one liking it, you can only imagine the consequences if that fear proves real. But Spence reassures him and tells him, who cares? He reminds James that he made a movie, and even if it's not good, that's something he can still take pride in. And as his movie plays, we can tell it's not Hollywood level quality, but the people enjoy it for what it is. And at the end of the movie within the movie, Brigsby faces off against his arch nemesis, Sun Snatcher, one last time. At this point, it has become clear to Brigsby he cannot escape the inevitable. In order to save the universe, Brigsby must destroy it.
I do not vibe with this universe. What the fuck?
Or does he? Instead of destroying it, with the power of his world's MacGuffin and referencing back to a theory James made on how to defeat Sun Snatcher, he instead folds the molecules of the universe itself into a singularity to not destroy it, but create a brand new one. I want to make that point clear because on first viewing, it does appear the Brigsby Bear universe is just destroyed, gone forever. But notice how they said, create.
Creating a whole new universe.
How will you create the universe?
James didn't end Brigsby Bear with it just dying and being forgotten like what others told him to just let happen. He had it literally end with the universe starting anew, this time without anything holding it back. Just like how James's life can finally start anew with nothing from his old life to hold him back. Finally able to enter the theater, James is met with not jeers, but applause. Applause from everyone. And amongst the crowd, he sees a familiar figure, Brigsby himself, his childhood brought to life. Finally fulfilled, both nod at each other understandingly, and while Brigsby teleports away for a new adventure somewhere else, James is happily embraced by all those around him, ready to begin his own new adventure. Which finally brings us to what I think makes this film so relevant in our nostalgia-ridden culture. I'm not even going to try to sugarcoat it. The whole theme of the movie is about how people, and our culture today, holds on to their childhood nostalgia and how we all, at some point, have to move on from it. Not let it go, move on from it. Even though we love to escape the galaxies far, far away, visit dinosaur theme parks, and fight alongside our favorite superheroes, we all have to remember it's not real. But the real world we live in does have a lot more to offer than a simple fiction ever could. The story of Brigsby Bear is about a guy who has defined his entire life by his love of a cheesy kids show and how, by making this movie with his new friends and family, goes on a journey of self-discovery as he explores the world around him, and how he's able to grow as a person and find something that means so much more to him. Now that may sound like it's saying you have to stop loving the stuff you love, but no, it's not saying that. The movie's stance on nostalgia is that nostalgia is like your phone. Everyone has it, but it can definitely be a little misplaced. James's love of Brigsby is the exact same thing. It's never portrayed as a bad thing, After all, it's the only lens he can see the world through. But it's something that's also inherently misplaced. It's the only thing he ever talks about. It's the only thing he loves. Hell, the first thing he does with his newfound freedom is want to watch the latest and last Brigsby Bear tape. James's journey through the film isn't the only thing portrayed like this. The movie's portrayal of nostalgia is, as such, portrayed in a similar light. James will never find something he loves just as much as Brigsby Bear, because nothing like Brigsby will ever come again. And sure, that movie may come close, but you can tell it's not Brigsby. But the film instead offers James, and even the audience, a unique alternative. Find something that those things don't give you. To go out there in the world and explore your own creativity, be it art, music, or even just simple nature walks. Whatever gets your creative juices flowing, and just do it because it's something you love. And of course, having finally found a good alternative, James finds happiness in what his new friends and family have given him that Brigsby never could. And through that, James is finally able to move on with his life and see what other wondrous things the world has to offer. Which is an interesting contrast to people's desires to relive those same nostalgic memories in this current generation, and how it's being used and peddled to varying degrees. Rather it be a heartfelt sequel that acts as a final send-off to what came before it, or a whole trilogy dedicated to destroying what preceded it. I think this movie stands as something not just relevant, but also timeless, as it's addressing how the media in general, regardless of the decade or generation, heavily banks on what came before it. The only other film I can think of that tackles our current nostalgia culture in a similar light would have to be Ready Player One. And while I think it's a good movie, I feel that its need to drench itself in a similar nostalgia bait kind of undermines that message.
Will you cut that out?
And that same message rings louder with Brigsby Bear, as it uses something fictional rather than something real. That's why I love Brigsby Bear. It tells people that, while the door may close on the media we hold dear, there's a lot more doors that are left unopened, and it's much more important to see where these doors lead you, as opposed to locking yourself inside just one. In a time where people say,
You're not a true fan if you don't see this.
Brigsby Bear comes and tells you, it's okay to move on to something else. There's so much more the world offers that this one thing cannot. Brigsby Bear is a heartfelt movie that bathes in that nostalgic feeling, yet loves the future and actively embraces it. This is why I think Brigsby Bear is a film I can recommend to anyone, and why I feel Brigsby Bear is so timelessly relevant. Hi guys, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button for future content. And if you want to support the channel, please consider checking out my Patreon and PayPal. Links are in the description below. And until next time, I will see you guys later.